Hey there, I'm Scott, and this is Tangents. Well, it is, I was going to say Sunday, Saturday, the 28th of January 2023. I can't believe we're already a month into 2023. I guess I should be able to because it's just how time works, but it's always disturbing, like how quickly it just boils away. So I've been back in the US for, I think, over a week now. In fact, I know over a week now. Uh, I'm not sure if I really. There are a lot of. I have a lot of thoughts on my time in Japan, and to some extent, I want to talk about those. To some extent, I'm not sure that there's that much that I could actually say, and I don't know. I've been kind of not really outlining, but kind of thinking of things that I wanted to talk about there. And I think what I might do is instead of originally I was thinking I might just do one of these that was literally just titled Japan. And then that would be the whole, I mean, as much as any of these are themed on something, that would have been that. I think instead, more likely, what I'm going to do is have, things kind of come in over time. I think that's probably more realistic, and it's also probably more honest because I've obviously experienced about a month in Japan, and I know a little bit about it, but it's not really a domain of expertise for me. So I have thoughts, I have lots of opinions, and my experiences led me to certain conclusions, or at least loose conclusions. But I can't really say that it's a thing that I know much about. I mean, it's a massive country with a lot of people in it, and I got a tiny, tiny taste of it. I definitely have been working on my Japanese, well, while I was there before and since coming back. And I don't know, I always think about language acquisition, and I know, there's this idea that when you're a kid, you pick things up really quickly. I'm not sure how true that is, and I definitely also know. I mean, obviously there is a time when your brain is kind of expanding the basis set, identifying and then using the basis set of sounds and concepts and all of this kind of stuff that makes sense for language. So whether versus are different sounds, or u are those different sounds, being able to make those sounds, being able to put things together in certain ways, that kind of stuff, there is a time after which it's much harder to acquire. But I think, when you're a kid, I mean, I can't speak for everybody. When I was a kid, I watched Ghostbusters so many times. You watch the same movie over and over again, or the same show, or the same whatever. And I just imagine if you were with your current brain as it is, and you spent years just sitting there working on this language acquisition, total immersion, and with all this repetition, and a lot of people kind of helping you and expecting you not to speak very well, I suspect your language acquisition would probably be as good, if not better, than when you were a kid. That being said, I've been really struggling with some things. Like I'm finally getting the days of the week like dialed in. It's one of these things, like they kind of come in little fits and starts. It's the standard sort of punctuated equilibrium thing where you learn something and then you learn and you struggle with it, and then you make some progress, and then you struggle and progress, versus sort of a continuous model. There may be some continuity there, but I feel like generally speaking, the way that it works is things are working and percolating, and you're definitely developing, but you kind of hit plateaus and then you have little leaps. That seems to be the way almost everything works. So the days of the week, finally getting counting. Counting has been a real pain in the ass because on one hand, Japanese, like compared to French, you don't have 420s and 10, for example, which is just weird. And in Belgium, they don't have that. They have, 90. 90 is actually a word. In Japan, it's just literally like 3, 10, 2. That's pretty easy. The problem is, of course, they have two different counting systems, and then they have different, in addition to ichi, ni, san, itotsu, futatsu, mitsu, like two different sets of words for the counting. In addition to that, they have the Chinese characters, and then they have the Arabic characters, and they have a bunch of things like counters. So it's not just that you have different words for things, but you have different words that come into play when you're measuring different things. Like if they're small items, it's different than minutes, and it's different than, and you start learning this kind of stuff, and it is making, like, things are coming together slowly, but it's a pain in the ass. It's really frustratingly slow. I never know, like, am I acquiring things more? If I would have tried the same thing 20 years ago, would it have been easier? Or is it just that my memory is, like, you remember the progress, you don't remember the struggle? I don't know. I do remember for sure when I took classes when I was younger, things would just stick. If I paid attention during the lecture, I just owned it. And I still kind of have that. And I think part of the difference is some of the things that I'm working on now are like with aviation. You have to know, well, this is part 91, and a bunch of different numbers and details like that, memorizing specific numbers or specific characters or specific words. That's different than remembering the concepts. I still get the concepts pretty quickly. The details I struggle with, which is also weird because, like, I remember learning anatomy in high school, and I'd see it one time, sternocleidomastoid muscle, and hear it, and maybe I'd hear it repeated once, but generally not. And then you just have it. And that definitely is not the case now. Like, I will sit there in the app and work on it and work on it and work on it. And I may even have it at a certain point, and then it just evaporates. Or like the hiragana and the katakana, I've mostly got dialed in, but there are a couple of characters that just will not stick. And I don't know why they won't stick. I don't know what is the holdup. I don't know what it is that, like, with my brain, that just won't quite do it. But there are certain things that just won't get in there. And it's frustrating. It's one of these things. I do think, and I've said this about flying and other things, it's good to work on something where you go through that process of being a novice and sucking at something, and then developing, and then kind of getting good at it. I think the thing where I really had the realization about that first was climbing. Because I never had that experience that I was climbing and I was like, oh, it looks so easy and I should be able to figure it out. I didn't have that part of the novice thing. I did have, like, it wasn't that easy when I started. But I don't know, something about the way that I think about things is not so much comparing myself to others, but sort of to myself. And I would just, go up the route, and it was either something I could do or not. And especially early on, it was not that big of a deal. And I started out, 5'8", 5'9" was no problem. There were some 5'10s that I would struggle a bit on, but I could probably force my way through. And then over time, built that up, and at a certain point, I could get up like the 11 pluses and some 12 minuses. And it's frustrating now because it's getting up there is just exponentially harder. It was very quick to get to like 10 plus, or even sometimes like the 10 plus to 11 minus. Some of those I could get, and then there would be like one or two moves that would be a struggle. Getting up from 10 plus to like an 11 was an enormous amount of effort and took time, and it just, so much repetition and so many trials and all of this. And it was frustrating. But it didn't feel like I was learning particularly slowly, other than I had a friend who could watch somebody do a route, and then he had some kind of understanding of both his model of what other people are doing and his model of what his body is doing was such, and his memory for this stuff was such that he could remember, okay, they did this and they did this and they did this and they did this. And then he could just replicate it, and it made it much easier for him. Now, solving the problems was not as easy, but that part was easy for him. And for me, it's more, I would sit there and I'd figure it out, and then I'd finally get it. And when I got it, I didn't, obviously I knew what I was doing because I could do it again and again and again. But if you asked me, like, how did you do this? Without putting myself in that position, I had no idea. I don't have a great kinesthetic sense, I guess, of what my body's doing and all of this, which is odd because I do think yoga helped that a little bit, because when you're doing it, you really have to think about what you're doing, and there are so many things that superficially maybe feel like you're doing the same thing and then you're not, and then you have somebody kind of help you and they're like, oh, you're doing this, but really you just do this, and then you're like, oh, that's different. Like, you feel like, oh, this is super easy, and then somebody's like, well, that's because you're doing this, and then you just make a tiny shift or whatever, and all of a sudden, oh shit, this is actually work, and you can feel the difference pretty markedly. Climbing also, like, so much of it, I guess there's an element of skill and fitness and all of this, which is very important. If you go climbing and you've not gone climbing in even just a month or two, your fingers, and especially your forearms, you just never use those muscles. So those will be tired. They will be exhausted for a while. It's always taken me weeks to get that dialed in, even going 2 or 3 times a week. But there's also this aspect of exactly how you have your body positioned, or like if you see a hold, and the difference between having your fingers just like this versus like that. And you probably can't see it because, or you're listening to this, but just like these tiny little movements of, or the weird ones are like you shift your hips over this way or that way, and based on where your weight is balanced and what the forces are, where's the normal force coming from your foot on this hold in this particular, that kind of stuff makes the difference between a move being almost zero stress and zero effort, and being maybe you could push your way through it, but really challenging, if not impossible. So anyway, moving from that, the very different, the thing that got me, the thing that opened my eyes a bit there was people would come in, and periodically I'd have a friend or friend of a friend or somebody else's, whatever. Somebody would come in and they'd go to the gym, and a lot of people would see people climbing and they'd be like, oh, that looks easy. And then they'd try and really struggle and get very frustrated. And the thing that just always struck me about that is, like, anyone who's actually good at something went through, unless you had some magical innate ability. And even then, I think probably there's a period of, like, innate ability will get you so far. You still have to go through certain steps to get to where you're probably going. But anyone who's good at something was at one point a novice. At one point they were not good at it. The most eloquent speaker in the world at one point was making gaga goo goo noises. The person with the strongest ability at math once couldn't do it. And that kind of thing, I don't know, it sits with me. I do think there are certain things that I don't know. And again, I don't know if it's age, or if it's that I'm learning different kinds of things, or if it's just being out of practice because I haven't been in school for so long. There have been a lot of things that I found very frustrating. The most asshole-ish way of putting this would be like, oh, it's the instructors. And I do think the instructor matters. I definitely, like, even when I was in school, I'd take electromagnetism, and the professor was just so good and would just get it and barely had to work in that class. And then I took optics, and in high school I did optics in physics, and it was not hard at all. I had a really good teacher, actually. Um, but then I got to this optics class in grad school, and I think I got a C in that class. I really like it was the worst grade by far that I had, and I struggled terribly. And that one I would say, yeah, I could safely blame on the instructor. I could have still learned it on my own, but it was just not a good experience and did not coalesce things, did not crystallize them in my mind. And optics is not that hard. I mean, obviously, optics can be very difficult. You can get into very advanced stuff with like a sun shield, that kind of thing. You have to go into Fourier space and figure out this weird pattern and all. It gets complicated, right? But when you're just talking about like basic geometric optics and this kind of stuff, it's not that complicated. And having a bad instructor there definitely hurt. Still got it, but you know. There was an intermediate one, I guess, which was StatMech. And that one, the optics I didn't care enough about to really teach myself on my own. E&M and quantum mechanics and classical mechanics, I had really good professors. And literally just sitting in the class, it just clicked. Really even without doing much homework. StatMech, that one, the professor was not very good. And I had to struggle and work a lot on my own to kind of figure out the concepts of it. And for me, the difference between being good and not is really understanding how things work versus and presenting them in a way that kind of lets you build the stuff up yourself versus these are the formulas and just memorize them. And this is what happens here, just memorize it. That does not work for me. And so I guess in that sense, the memorization and not having ever really trained myself to be good at that, or maybe not being very good at it, maybe that's no different. I definitely, like when I was younger, and I took French for middle school, high school, and undergrad. It wasn't until graduate school later on when I took a conversational course where I started really caring and actually getting good at it. And the rest of it was just kind of going through the motions. But there was someone who I was interested in and magically helps a lot. And I took Spanish because she's Mexican and was motivated. And being motivated in that one semester, I learned so much more, so much faster. Now, I had some basis from my family, my dad's side of the family is Spanish. Obviously had some contact with it, had some overlap between Spanish and French, although they interfere a little bit, so it's not the greatest pair. But it is interesting when you're motivated how much faster you can acquire certain things. And that one was independent of, it was independent of the instructors, still took a lot of, like flashcards and memorizing and working on stuff that way. The Japanese, I don't have something driving me. In fact, I couldn't tell you specifically why I'm even doing it. I could very easily not. And I mean, it seemed like the thing to do when I decided that I was going to go to Japan for a while. But other than that, like right now, I could just say like, I'm not gonna work on it. I'm still kind of driven to develop it. But memorizing the words and the kanji and even just the radicals and this kind of stuff, it's hard. It's a much bigger struggle than learning a lot of things. Like I would say calculus, pretty fucking easy in comparison. It's an interesting thing because calculus to me, you do have to memorize a couple of things, but mostly like once you understand the basics, unless you're getting into something like solving some weird integral and using Dirac's trick or something, this kind of stuff is hard. But if you're just talking about like understanding how integrals work or figuring out what is the volume of an n-sphere or what is the surface area of that, I guess the n-ball or the surface area of the sphere. Those kinds of calculations are not that bad. Learning how to do tensor calculus, it's hard, but it's more mechanical. Like once you get the basics of it, there's a lot of just kind of putting stuff in and turning the crank. And there's also an element of kind of knowing what are the right coordinates to use, what are the right, I don't want to say tricks, but there are ways. I always think about this with physics. If you look at the pendulum problem, for example, and you do the actual classical mechanics on something that's like a realistic pendulum, and I'm not even talking about like having a string that can stretch and contract, although that makes it more complicated, even if you're just using a linear spring or string. Having that pendulum and being outside of the linear regime, it's a really hard problem, actually. It's remarkably hard. But if you make a few assumptions, like, oh, well, the angle is small enough that sine of the angle is basically the angle. And the string, we're going to pretend that it's infinitely strong, so that length is fixed. And then you do a couple of things like this, and then it's just trivial, completely trivial. We're going to pretend that gravity is uniform. Little things like that, not pretending that gravity is uniform, makes it really hard. Having angles that are large makes it really hard. You get all kinds of additional behavior that you don't expect. But people a long time ago kind of figured out, well, okay, if we make these assumptions and these approximations, we can actually do pretty good and solve this particular problem. Now, I always think like the set of possible problems is huge. And part of the clever thing, and part of the reason why you study things like that, and the inclined planes and little trucks moving on the surface, and elastic and inelastic collisions and these kinds of things. All of these things, somebody a long time ago figured out, oh, this one we can actually solve, especially using this coordinate system and this set of variables and this set of techniques. If you looked at any other kind of problem, it's really easy to construct something that is highly, highly non-trivial. And yet, those are the ones we know. This is also, if you ever go to Florence, there's the Galileo Museum, and in there they have some of these old, like if you've taken physics, and then you go there and you're like, oh, that is the fucking thing that I did in elementary physics, and you're like, it's kind of remarkable, especially given how old this is, and that some things haven't changed that much since then. I mean, we've learned a few other problems to solve, but like quantum mechanics, even with just the simple Schrodinger equation and no relativity, if you put a particle in a box, that's a very simple problem to solve. You can do a lot of stuff with it. If you start having realistic potentials or any kind of interactions or all kinds of stuff, and it just becomes extremely complicated very quickly. So a lot of it is just understanding what the right problems are, what are the right ways of looking at those problems. I think this is, it's kind of covertly one of the things that leads really to our ability to do all of this. Like if you look at the technology in the phone that I'm using here, a lot of that is really just sort of figuring out how to make really fast, really small, low noise switches, and figuring out how to program that, and figuring out a few of these little steps that make things much, much easier. And in aggregate, with enough people working on that for a long enough time, you get a supercomputer in your pocket that can recognize what I'm saying and see my face and do things like this. It's kind of extraordinary. I do think, as magical as those things are, or as magical as ChatGPT is, you look at that and you really, you scratch beneath the surface, and the two conclusions come. One, it's kind of a magic trick. It's not as impressive as you would think. And two, equally important, it's not it gives you a certain kind of solution for a certain kind of problem. And if you get outside of that scope, it falls apart very, very quickly. If you try to apply those same things that you did for that inclined plane to something a little bit more complicated, or something where there's a little bit of nonlinear dynamics, or there's viscosity or some other physics involved, it gets much more complicated much quicker, or very quickly. And in a simulation, you can kind of build on these things, but when you're don't have the concepts or you don't have the mathematical tools, sometimes things are just not, you start putting in turbulence, or the things that create turbulence. Figuring that kind of stuff out is very hard. And understanding what's going to happen with these eddies and this multi-scale kind of thing, and what's going to happen, you start putting in combustion or stuff like this, it gets very, very complicated. And it's very easy to get things to a point where you just hit that boundary. And it's not to say that you can't get past that boundary, but once you're trying to work past that boundary, you're at that point where somebody else a long time ago solved the problem, and you're seeing this little tiny piece which somebody else spent potentially a lifetime figuring out. And anyway, talking about all of this, the thing that, one of the things that that made me think of this is, obviously, it's like magically somebody else gets killed by the cops. Now the cops happen to be black, and they're actually facing consequences, kind of, relatively speaking at least, which is interesting. But I've talked to Gil about this, and I remember, not to pick on him, but I remember this thing, like, this was him saying this, but ACAB means all. Like, all cops are bastards. And yeah, all. And the reason that the thing that's frustrating here is it's taken me, I am where I am, but to get where I am took me a lot of thinking, a lot of learning, a lot of experience, a lot of all of this kind of stuff. It's not like I came to the position I'm at overnight. And I'm certainly also not a rash person. I'm not somebody who just jumps on things, or all cops are bad. Making a generalization that's not true. It's not my thing, generally speaking. And the thing is, fundamentally, and the reason that I say all cops, and I mean all cops, is that, and maybe, okay, in Tokyo are the cops bastards? I don't know. I definitely would not say no. But the problem is here, you have these organizations and these structures, this system, which has been built up over time, coming with a pretty strong pedigree from slave patrols and things like this. And it is inherently racist. It is inherently dehumanizing. It's structured in such a way that just being part of that system compels you to behave in a certain way. And it compels you to be a bastard. Now, people individually can be nice people. They can, be caring or considerate. They could be respectful. They could be all of these things. The problem is, when you're in a system that drives you to do certain things, it's the reason why, if you're listening to something you're watching this on YouTube, people are putting ads in all their shit. Because they have to. Because unless you have some way to kind of exist outside of that system, you're constrained by the very system. You're constrained to, it's the reason why all of the YouTube videos have that same kind of ridiculous picture and big text, and somebody making that crazy face, because that stuff works. The system, the algorithm, the economy that we're in, all of this kind of stuff drives people to do certain things. It drives people to be selfish and greedy. And to some extent, you can't blame people. You can, but in some sense you can't, because people have to eat. They have to have shelter. They have to, and so that puts you in a position where you're okay, well, fuck, I have to do this. What can I do? And you have a limited set of options there. And those options guide you down certain paths. And you also have the situation where you take a tiny step, take another tiny step, take another tiny step, and you may not like where you're going. You may not, when you started, you might have gone into the police force with good intentions. You're going to reform things. You're going to make things better. You're going to be the person who gets in there and changes things. Or you became a politician. and you're going to be the person that gets into Congress and actually like changes things. But the problem is these systems are structured in such a way, and they have this ability really to push people in a certain direction, and you have to make compromises, right? You start making a little, okay, this is where I am. I want to get something done, so I'm going to be a little bit nice to this person who has power. I want to get something done, and I know in this situation, yeah, I don't like what I just saw, but if I speak up, I'm going to get beaten down, metaphorically probably, but potentially physically. Or I'm just going to have bad consequences, so people don't speak up. And they see like little thing, they don't speak up, and they see bigger thing, and well, last time I didn't speak up for that littler thing. This is a little bit bigger, yeah. And then the next thing you know, somebody's got their fucking knee on somebody's neck, and people are just standing around, even the people who are, air quotes, good cops. It's the thing that makes people who become the police chief in Phoenix, who I believe probably went in thinking they were going to do things that were going to help, and yet they become part of that system. They become someone who's not only participating in it actively, like it's not just that you're in that system and kind of passively going for the flow, you're actively building and reproducing that system and reinforcing the things that are making the system suck. It's a really giant problem, because when you think about it, and especially like you combine politics does this, the police force does this, it kind of, and I definitely do not want to imply that this is a hopeless situation. I get annoyed actually when people think, oh, just throw up your hands, you can't do anything. There once were kings, right? I mean, there still kind of are kings, but there was a time where, you know, if a king wanted to fuck your wife, you basically were fucked. You're like, okay, go have your divine right. Yeah, it was a thing, and that's no longer the case, hopefully. You have situations where, you know, there is a lot of progress over time, and the problem is it's very slow. You know, things that seem insurmountable can change, but they take a lot of time. They take really that same kind of seismic shift where you build that pressure over time. And I mean, there are things in geology where it's like, okay, you're gonna slowly wear away, and layer by layer, eventually you dig out the Grand Canyon. But a lot of things are also like pressure and strain and tension and compression and all these things, and they build up and they build up, and then all of a sudden there's a fracture, and that fracture releases some energy, and it just propagates through the system and just shatters things. Those kinds of things do and can happen. The danger, of course, is that, you know, when you have these kinds of systems, the systems really want to keep going. So like if you imagine you had somehow a politician got in and they actually wanted to defund the police, which I say all the time, it shouldn't be a thing that people, if I say defund the police or I say all cops are bastards, people act like, Scott, how are you being so unreasonable? That's why would you? It's not an absurd thing. It's like they're getting, in Phoenix, almost $1 billion a year. You go to LA and New York, they're getting many billions of dollars a year. Defunding them, it's a reasonable thing. It's not a, yeah, and there are so many studies which you can look at where people are afraid and they have this distorted idea of, oh, if I don't have the cops, then I'm gonna get fucked over, or these things are gonna happen. It doesn't really, there's a ton of work, there's a ton of research, a ton of evidence that shows that cops do not prevent crime. Really, I mean, at all, basically. Like, within the noise level, within the statistical margin. Now, it's different if you're in a place which is truly lawless, and then suddenly you put enforcement in. It goes down to a certain level. It works to a certain, assuming that they don't become corrupted by the system, which is, yeah, if there's a pre-existing system of crime, the cops can very easily become subsumed into that, and the law enforcement becomes the enforcer of that crime and of the things that were there. But assuming that doesn't happen, yeah, if there's just rampant crime and people are just murdering people on the streets, to some extent cops help. That's a certain amount. But then you get to where we are, and there's very little crime. Well, I guess it depends on what kind of crime and what kind of, obviously there's a lot of crime at a, if Pelosi wants to do insider trading, that seems like a crime to me, and it's no big deal somehow. There are a lot of things going on, but never mind that stuff now. When you're talking about like somebody's going to rape you or murder you or beat you up or this kind of stuff, that's fairly rare. Statistically relatively rare compared to decades ago, and that time compared to centuries ago. And when you're in this situation, more cops do not change the situation. They're not helping things at all. They're not investigating the crimes. They're not, I mean, if you ever have a car stolen, it's hilarious to try calling the cops, because I had this. My ex-wife and I had a Ford Explorer, which I'm still embarrassed by, but she got it as like a gift from her dad. She had this SUV, and somebody stole it. And we talked to the cops, and they're like, okay, you can file a report, and we'll do the thing for insurance. But they basically laugh at you if they're like, are you going to find it? I mean, and this is not even getting to the rape kits sitting on the shelf endlessly, or if you actually try to imagine that the rape kit is run, and you actually get the person. The odds that that person is going to face any kind of consequences at all, minuscule. It is obscene, like truly. And so you sit there and you're like, well, what are the cops fucking doing? Really, like 5%. This is consistent across precincts and across jurisdictions, all of this kind of stuff. Something like 5% of what they do has anything to do with violent crime. And the bulk of that is just kind of like filing reports afterwards and not really doing anything about it. There are things where, they're actually doing something, but it's the exception of the exception. If you go around, like whenever I see cops around Phoenix, they're either driving around, often on their computers while they're driving, which seems a little dangerous, but never mind that now. But they're driving around just fucking off. They're in the middle of a pandemic, not getting vaccinated, and a bunch of them are going maskless into restaurants. Or they're harassing unhoused people. There are like 3 SUV cop cars out at a bus stop, and there's some dude there who just didn't have any place to go. And it's hard not to think like, well, if your fucking salaries were going to providing shelter for somebody like this, they would be fine. And maybe they need mental health care. It's possible, but you're not trained to do any of this stuff. You're not, like, these people have almost no background for this kind of stuff. And they're used in ways that, like, even if they had good intentions and they wanted to help, they can't. They're not capable of it. They're not the right people to do it. They're not, like, if they're addressing domestic violence, ignoring the fact that a bunch of cops commit domestic violence, not even getting into that, they're not the people who are trained to deal with it. And even if they've kind of been trained, they've had like some little class, or they've had like little, like seminar or something that's pretty much worthless. And they're not able to do these things. They're also like, yeah, if somebody's shooting, you have an armed person in body armor, maybe that's helpful. But if you have somebody who is, again, like this armed, basically soldier with body armor and a gun and a taser and all this shit, more often than not, they escalate the situation, because you see that and it raises the stakes. It's the same reason why, like, people think, oh, if I have a gun at home, I'm going to protect myself. Well, no, probably what's going to happen, but most probably nothing is ever going to happen, right? And then if every, you know, exception of exceptions, somebody actually does break in, you're probably not going to get the gun. You're probably, if you get the gun, you've escalated the situation. You've potentially armed somebody. You know, it's pretty much a statistical wash uh, between whether or not it's going to help you or not. And, you know, having one versus not having one in that particular circumstance. And then you look at all of the other negative effects in addition to that, like suicide, for example, or killing somebody else, or kids killing somebody else intentionally or not. It's just net negative. And yeah, you can't, this is another one of these things where you have this system that you have to deal with. And it's frustrating because, like, there's a part of me that wants to sort of, you know, run for office or something like that, or, you know, like try to help in a certain way. But the problem is, you know what is involved, and you know, like, yeah, I mean, I do think there are things you can do. There are certain forms of lobbying, or there are certain forms of, yeah, totally ignoring that, like going to something, because this is a giant mess, and just going to put it aside for a second. But imagine something else that's dumb, that should be a no-brainer. Light rail, metro, this kind of stuff. Now, I haven't brought up Japan, but being in Japan, and especially being it's different when you're like in some little city, or not that Nagano is a little city, but, you know, you're out and they have buses that come infrequently and really no public transit other than that. You kind of need a car, or you're walking, or, you know. But if you're in Tokyo, someplace like that, you can walk all over. It's pretty nice. I've walked all around the city and out into the outskirts. And then wherever you are, there are trains, and it's easy to get on a train. If you show up at the station, most of the day you show up and you're waiting a few minutes at most. You know, there are times when it's a little bit longer, but for the most part, it's like you show up, you don't have to look at the schedule or do anything like this. You get from A to B. And even on the Shinkansen, like even the high-speed trains, you could literally, now I had the JR pass, but if I was just living there, and then you just kind of are like, okay, I want to go from Tokyo to Hokkaido. You could go to the station, go to the ticket machine, punch in, like, okay, this is where I want to go, pay your $20 or whatever it costs. And if there's probably a train within a half hour, often, you know, for the popular routes within maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and you can just go over to the track, walk to the train, hop on the train, and you're there. Like, it's compared to the hell that is going to an airport and all of this, and never mind the places that you're going. If you're going, it's different again if you're going to some little city or someplace that doesn't have good infrastructure. But if you're going someplace that's like Tokyo to Kyoto, you get there, they have their own public transit system. They're all networked together. And you can just hop from the train to the public transit, get to your hotel. Maybe it's a 5 or 10 minute walk, but it's pretty easy. And just like the difference in that versus if I want to go see my mom and sister in LA, okay. And I live in Gilbert, which is dumb. But imagine you live in Tempe, which is relatively best case scenario. And you happen to live near a light rail station, which most people don't. You can take that light rail to not the airport, but near the airport, which is an awesome thing that the taxi lobby, a few others, but I think they were the primary ones who were responsible for this, got to have, you know, they were able to prevent this. But they were able to do that, and then you can get there and you can take a shuttle kind of and get to the, you could do it. And then I'd get to LA, and if I went to LAX, there's a bus that goes to the station. No train from LAX, but then, which is crazy. If I went to Burbank, which is closer to where my mom and sister are, you're basically like, am I gonna walk 45 minutes? Am I gonna, I could take a bus, but it's also gonna take 45 minutes because they're infrequent and they're not, you know, they don't go point to point. you just look at that, and this is LA. This is not a small city. It's just, and in Phoenix also, it's annoying. And one of the things, I don't know, I think about this at least. Like Gilbert, I've talked about this many times. All the people on the city council were like anti-light rail and anti-apartments. Similarly in Scottsdale. And both of these are places that should obviously, and I think one day will obviously be connected to the public transit here, eventually. Which is annoying because it's like you see inevitably where things will go, barring catastrophe. And it's like, why do we have to wait? Why can't we just move the needle here? So one of the things I think about is trying to address that. And I think the way to really get this, I mean, this is kind of true in general. If you want stuff done, finding the right people who are in a position to do it, and then convincing them in the right way. So, for example, you have the Chamber of Commerce. Now, if you go directly to the Chamber of Commerce, you're probably not going to succeed, or at least it's going to be a lot of work. But what I think you could do is start talking to people who have businesses in Gilbert, businesses in Scottsdale. And you start getting them on board with the idea that, well, if you had trains coming in, then you get a lot more traffic. You get a lot more people coming in, which means a lot more money. And, you know, it's not that hard to... I think you could totally do this. It would just be a matter of putting in the time and effort, which is considerable, to be fair. And then you get them to push on the city council and on the Chamber of Commerce, and then they push on the city, and then eventually that stupid light rail that goes down to Mesa and then stops could make a right turn on Gilbert Road and come out to Gilbert, or go to Scottsdale. And eventually maybe you get another line, or maybe it's annoying because it's a thing that's not, it's not like people aren't doing this, but it just takes so many people and so much time and so much effort. And that's not even like trying to figure out how to fix the cops. I mean, by fix, I mean probably get rid of, but to be fair, like I say something like that and people are like, and I understand, like you can't imagine something that you've not seen, but there are things you could do for most of the stuff that cops do that is not like a police force. Most of the stuff that they do, really like 95% of it, is stuff that would be better done by somebody who, I mean, even with respect to crime, somebody who's actually a trained investigator, not a uniformed cop, somebody who's a trained counselor. You're going out and helping homeless people, which they're not doing. They're right, scraping them up and then pushing them away. But if you imagine that's the problem that you want to actually solve, we have a lot of unhoused people here. We have a lot of homeless people, and we want to help them. Not an easy problem, but it's not a good thing when you're sending the wrong people, armed people there to threaten them and scare them and just to push them off, versus like they don't even if a cop wanted to, they don't have something that they can do to help these people. That's the thing that's like, if you're like, I'm gonna go help people, good fucking luck. As a cop, probably not. And yeah, I mean, the worst thing also is people kind of get subsumed into the system, and then the next thing you know, you're out talking to the NAACP Youth Council and spreading propaganda there and sitting there like, oh, we're actually friendly and you should be nice and friendly to the cops and you should look at cops as like a friend. As like, I don't know. I mean, cops will kill you. Like, I'm a middle-aged white dude and cops scare me, and I think reasonably so. And, if you're black and you have cops around, you're not irrational to be nervous about that. Like, this is a person who can kill you, they can imprison you, they can fuck over your life pretty easily, even if you're not killed or injured. This is not a person that you should look to and be like, oh, they're just a teddy bear. Like, no, they're fucking scary, reasonably scary. And all of this shit just annoys me because it's like so obvious and so clear, and yet so difficult to address and so time consuming. And I do think maybe eventually some of these things get addressed. It's not impossible, but it's hard, and it's going to take a long fucking time. Similarly, actually, like, you see these people with immigration. Like, I thoroughly believe the world should basically be like the Shenzhen area in Europe, where you can, if you were born in Spain, you could work in the Netherlands, you could live in Germany, you could go to Portugal or what, you could just kind of like exist. And it's like in the United States, if you want to, there's nothing that says I have to go immigrate if I want to move to California or New York. I can do that. Imagine if you could do the same thing, like if I want to go to Australia or Japan or Mexico or Canada. Imagine like the world as a Shenzhen area. And it's not that hard. And also, like, it's not going to dilute the country's nationalities and all this kind of stuff. Certainly hasn't happened in Europe. B, it's not going to like have a bunch of immigration that lowers the standards of living or has a bunch of workers. The thing is, like that kind of stuff, to the extent that that's a thing, and it's largely not, markets don't work. I mean, it's like if you have an uneven levels of water and you have a dam between them. If you cut that dam, water will flow one way, right? But things will balance themselves out and you'll hit a new equilibrium and things will be net better for everybody. And never mind also that, the imaginary stuff like, oh, they're going to take your jobs. It's like, well, are they going to take your jobs? Are the people that, and the problem is, of course, the jobs that people who would be immigrants would take, probably you don't want to do. They're underpaid. And then also, right now, the way things are, they're still coming in and they're working for people who hire them illegally. And they're working for inherently unscrupulous people, because if they were scrupulous, they wouldn't do it. And so they're taking advantage of the fact that they can be completely fucked. And so they're like, well, you could try to go to law enforcement and say that we're overworking you or whatever, but then we're going to deport you. And so what they're actually doing is creating a labor force who, under threat of law, under threat of deportation or being imprisoned or whatever, they have to work much harder for much lower pay than you would. So the current situation is actually driving down labor costs. It's driving down prices. It's fucking up the things. So people imagine, oh, well, if you open the borders, things will be bad. Well, actually, things probably would go the other direction. Maybe the cost of some goods goes up. Although the thing that's crazy there is like the cost of lettuce. I remember seeing this years ago, and then it's one of these things where you look into it and it seems so insane that it can't be right, and then you look into it and it's true, and it's like, holy shit. The cost of lettuce going up like 1 cent per, I was going to call it a loaf, but per head, is enough to double what you're paying the people who are collecting the lettuce. Because they're working, like, it takes, their touch time for that lettuce is so short, and they're getting paid so little that, 1 cent doubles what you're paying them. So, you look at the greed, like the sheer just shittiness of the people who are running these things. And you think about it, like, it's not probably going to drive up the cost of produce that much. And you also eliminate this sort of black market labor force that is driving down the price of wages and driving down the things that, so it's, I would say, net positive. And also, like, I would love to be able to, I'd love to be able to just move to Australia for a few years, or move to Japan, or move to, Paris. And imagine the world that you could have if you could just travel freely and live freely. It'd be better for everybody, really. Another thing that, but you have people who are, and again, you have this thing where it's not just the Republicans, like, oh, they're gonna, the bullshit there. You have a lot of Democrats who are like this too. And so part of the problem is, again, the system. It's not the individuals, it's kind of the system. And even for the Republicans, like, you can understand there's this system that rewards them for lying about things and for making up bullshit and for doing this kind of stuff. It would be hard if you were an ethical Republican who actually believed in, air quotes, conservatism and all of this kind of stuff, like in the classical sense of conservatism. It would be very difficult for them to exist in the market that is there. And they would either get pushed to do the Trumpian kind of shit, or they'd get expelled from the party, basically. And similarly with the Democrats, if you're not in the neoliberal, like, oh, we need to fund the police and all this kind of bullshit, you're not going to succeed. You're going to have a lot of trouble. And again, the systems make things very difficult. And the problem, and I'm going to actually mention the word that this is titled by, appeasement, keeps these things going. Because every time somebody sits there, and I'm going to use the example of the Democrats appeasing the Republicans, but this is a very general problem. Every time the Republicans say something that's insane and completely disconnected from reality, and then the Democrats work in that space that they've created, they're reinforcing the reality that these people are creating. So, like, defund the police should be a no-brainer. If you looked at the price, like, the police force are getting the amount of money that we're spending, hundreds of billions of dollars on police, would make them the third largest military in the world, after China and our own, which is itself more than 3 times what China spends. So defunding the military also should be a complete no-brainer. Like, you should look at that and go like, holy shit, this is not where money should be going. Maybe spend some money on your infrastructure, which is shitty. Maybe spend some money on all the people that are unhoused. Maybe spend some money on making public transit. Maybe spend some money on making your world better, and education and all these kinds of things. And actually things that are investments that will have high ROI in the future. Maybe spend money on making people want to live in your country and making the life experience of people here better. Those things are probably better investments. And yet, you have Joe Biden and all of these other, I pick on Joe Biden, but he is the symptom more than the cause. You have all these fucking Democrats who will not, and it's a problem there, because all of these cities, New York is run by a fucking cop, right? It's a Democratic city run by a cop. LA, San Francisco, Minneapolis. You go through and you see all these people who are, again, Democratic-led cities, and they're sitting there saying like, oh no, we have to support the police. We have to, we can't just defund the police. Like, they're shutting down what should be the most obvious conclusion. And the problem is, by them doing that, they just pull the rug out from under anyone like me who reasonably looks at the situation as like, you should really fucking defund these people. You should really decimate the amount of money that you're giving. Like, literally take it. I mean, decimate would be take a tenth of it, but it should be like 5% at most of what you're currently spending going to law enforcement. And most of the money that was going there should go to a bunch of other buckets that actually would achieve the goals that they're supposed to be doing. That should be a no-brainer. And by standing in the way of that, you're making it impossible. When you're Joe Biden sitting there saying, fund the police, you're sitting there making it impossible for me to sort of rationally go like, no, defund the motherfuckers, without looking like a crazy person and without looking like I'm being irrational, or like it's just so frustrating, because the cops, the Republicans are going to do, and they're going to say what they're going to say. Joe Biden says fund the police. He does fund the police. He expands the police. He does all these things. The Republicans still say he's defunding the police. They're still saying he's doing all the things that would be good. He's going to get accused of this stuff anyway. Like, it's the whole fucking tax and spend thing. Democrats always get afraid of being accused of just taxing and spending. Tax and spend, tax. If they would actually tax the fucking rich and spend on things that people would feel, do the thing that you're accused of and that you're terrified of being called out for, the world would be a better place. It's the fact that you're buying into this stuff and you're appeasing these people who are being irrational and being just unreasonable. That is what makes things suck. Doing things like, oh, we've got, And I mean, it drives me insane too because we have the debt ceiling, which should have been fixed. You know, there's no reason that the debt ceiling should exist. If you've already allocated that we're going to spend this money, okay, you're spending it. There shouldn't be a separate little valve there. That part is dumb. But in addition to this, I see Democrats going like, well, a quarter of all of this came from Trump. Who gives a fuck? Honestly, they don't give a fuck. They sit there and they talk about how much that's the fucking evidence that they don't give a fuck. Because if they gave a fuck, they would have said something when he did it. They don't care. You shouldn't give a shit about this stuff. Because, I mean, I'm not even talking about like modern monetary theory or anything that says, you know, like, well, it doesn't really matter how much. Ignoring that, you know, you could spend quite a bit and not have consequences. And I think that is pretty much a given, honestly. And you can build up national debt within reason. It's not like your personal finances. The problem is, of course, people sort of irrationally imagine that things work the same way for a country as they do for an individual. It's not true. But even if they did, you know, you can raise taxes and balance the budget and all this kind of stuff, but they won't do it. And then you get like Democrats bragging about, oh, we've increased the corporate rate to something that's ridiculously low and much lower than Eisenhower had it, and or even Reagan. You know, it's just so frustrating because it's like you're fucking the Overton window. You're making it impossible for us to get where we need to get because what we need to do is so far over here, and you're acting like, well, this is what we really can do, and this is what's reasonable, and then we're not even going to get there. It's the reason why I kind of despise these people. It's not the reason, it's a reason, but it's frustrating. Anyway, with that, I've got to go get lunch. So with that, I'm going to break for now, but I'm annoyed as often. Thank you as always, and 再见.